The original Final Fantasy, releasing on the Famicom in 1987, revolutionized the RPG genre. Arguably the most influential JRPG of the time, and definitely the most influential JRPG on the NES, Final Fantasy launched a series that spans well over 100 games and has earned Square approximately $10 gajillion. I actually have pretty limited experience, relatively speaking, with Final Fantasy, having only played this original Final Fantasy, Final Fantasy III, Final Fantasy VII, Final Fantasy VII Crisis Core, Final Fantasy XVI, and Final Fantasy Mystic Quest. Of those, my first was this game, the original release of Final Fantasy on NES. Having played the original release of the game, and now the most recent release of the game, it definitely follows the trend of older games are harder, because the Pixel Remaster on Switch, PS4, Xbox Series, and Steam definitely take off a ton of the BS and bugs that made the original release a bit of a slog in parts. The original Final Fantasy is widely available, having released on the NES, and then later the NES Classic Edition, the MSX2, PS1, Wii, Wii U, PS4, Xbox Series, Wonderswan Color, Game Boy Advance, PSP, Java, Windows Phone, iOS, Android, and PC. And it was also released on the 3DS, lest I forget that. However, what I'm going to be focusing on here is the Pixel Remaster, which I've recently replayed on Switch. While the Pixel Remaster is a very faithful remake of the original game, it does make some stylistic changes that may or may not appeal to purists. There are sharper visuals, updated and much more detailed sprites, an updated UI that actually allows for full words and a much more readable font, and a plethora of quality of life changes. These visual changes are mainly to keep a relatively constant visual presentation across the first 6 Final Fantasy games that are included in the Pixel Remaster collection. So this game looks more akin to its Super Nintendo descendants than the original NES release. The nostalgic part of me does mourn the loss of those clunky sprites, but I would be lying if I said that the overall feel and tone of the game didn't benefit from these more detailed pixel sprites. To the remaster's credit, these sprites weren't just redone by random interns. They were redone from the ground up by the original artist, Kazuko Shibuya, so they feel very much authentic, even if they are new and more detailed. The remaster has also been designed for widescreen, although there are some minor frame pacing issues, so folks who are sensitive to frame rate dips might notice some mild judder. I personally didn't notice anything, but I'm not terribly sensitive to judder, and I know this is a common complaint online, so just bear that in mind. The biggest change here, and one that I personally adore, is that the soundtrack has been completely redone. You can still set it to use the iconic original chiptune soundtrack if you want that nostalgia trip, but the new arrangement is a beautiful orchestral recreation that feels more like a realization of what the original soundtrack was meant to be if not for the limits of 8-bit hardware, rather than an attempt to change things, per se. Don't get me wrong, I love a good chiptune soundtrack, but having been a trumpet player from 5th through 12th grade, I have a real soft spot for orchestral soundtracks, so the new arrangement made for the Pixel Remaster really blew me away. For the soundtrack alone, I definitely recommend that you play the Pixel Remaster, and if you are playing that version, definitely use the new orchestral soundtrack. The quality of life features are really what make the most difference here with this news remaster. The biggest aspects of that are the ability to toggle run as your default movement speed in towns and dungeons, the ability to toggle random encounters on or off, which is super useful if you're out grinding and you overextend yourself a bit and need to get back to town quickly and safely, and the boosts. These boosts allow you to adjust the rate of XP, ability points, and gold gained from 4 times the normal rate for an easier, less grindy experience, all the way down to 0.5 times, or half the original rate, if you not only want that original grind, but you want to Dark Souls the original grind and the game's overall difficulty. Additionally, you have the ability to quick save anywhere you want, even in dungeons right before a boss, and these quick saves can be accessed even if you close the game and turn off the system. That alone makes bosses a lot more manageable, although I personally didn't find any of the bosses to be particularly difficult, save for the game's final boss. You also have a bestiary that catalogs things like stats and drops for the monsters you defeat, making it easy to reference the strengths and weaknesses of the foes you face in any given dungeon. The overall experience is preserved very well from its NES roots. The 6 classes, Fighter, Thief, Black Belt, White Mage, Black Mage, and Red Mage, are still your class options, and the quest to restore the 4 crystals and defeat Garland remains unchanged. At default XP, ability point, and guild drop settings, which is how I played, the game is a challenge, but it's a very manageable challenge if you're willing to grind a little bit. And the overall improvement to the game's flow and the speed of the game makes it less time-consuming and obnoxious to grind than it was on the NES original, especially with the ability to toggle auto battle, which will have your characters automatically use the attacks they had used on the previous turn. Being an early 8-bit JRPG, Final Fantasy doesn't hold your hand as far as where you go and what to do. It definitely tells you what you need to do next, and it usually tells you the general direction of where you need to go, but you need to make sure you talk to every NPC, because that direction is not always given by the quote-unquote important NPCs exclusively. It also requires a fair amount of good old-fashioned exploring. Fortunately, the Pixel Remaster lets you pull up a world map that shows you where each location you've visited is, and even how many chests you've opened and how many chests there are total at that location. And that definitely makes it more user-friendly than the NES original, since it can be hard to remember the name of each town and village and where in the game's world each one is located. In general, I consider the Pixel Remaster to be the definitive way to experience the original Final Fantasy. This is especially true of the Switch version. It boasts slightly faster loading times than the PS4 or Steam versions, and it gives the option of portability. For example, I played the entire game while lounging in bed with my girlfriend over the course of a week. There is, however, a definite downside that needs to be noted. While the visual, orchestral soundtrack, and quality of life changes are amazing, the Pixel Remaster does lack the extra content found in the Game Boy Advance and PlayStation Portable versions of Final Fantasy. If you're going for the most content possible, and you're willing to sacrifice the modern improvements and conveniences found in the Pixel Remaster, one of those versions might be a better fit for you. The original Final Fantasy, while arguably the progenitor of the JRPG as we know it alongside Enix's Dragon Quest, hasn't aged terribly well in a lot of ways, despite being a solid game overall. The Pixel Remaster definitely gives it a nice facelift, and addresses some of those things that have aged poorly, such as the lack of full backgrounds in battle, and the absolute slog that grinding can be. But because it's a faithful remake, it retains some things that just don't stand up today, such as a thin story, non-existent character development, and often obtuse objectives. That said, the Pixel Remaster does make the game much more approachable for younger gamers, and it's also faithful enough to keep older gamers like me happy with this modern take on the experience. If you're into retro-style indie RPGs released in recent years, give the original Final Fantasy a shot in the Pixel Remaster collection. You'll probably find that a lot of what you like in indie JRPGs today is borrowed from this nearly 40-year-old juggernaut. My rating for Final Fantasy via the Pixel Remaster on Switch is a B.